Today, we're really getting into a pretty provocative take on recent geopolitical events. We're focusing hard on the Middle East and, what it all means globally. Our main source for this is an interview with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and author, defense, and foreign policy consultant. It's from the George Galloway YouTube channel. And what we want to do here is unpack his predictions, his insights. They're often quite surprising, maybe even stark. We want to help you understand his specific viewpoint on what's happening and what he sees as the real results of current actions, particularly for the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Absolutely. And it's really important we stress this up front. Our job here is just to present the arguments and the analysis from that interview. We're going to lay out the ideas impartially, exactly as they are in the source. We're not endorsing anything, just making sure you get a clear picture of Macgregor's thinking so you can draw your own conclusions.
Okay, let's dig in then. Colonel Macgregor starts with a really powerful statement right away. He says if he'd been consulted, the recent strike just wouldn't have happened. And because it did, he declares quite plainly, the United States is now at war with Iran.
Wow. Yeah, that's a definitive opening.
It really is. Sets a dramatic tone from the get-go.
And he doesn't just leave it there, does he? He explains why he thinks this. He claims this whole situation is something Israel, its lobby, and ultimately its agents in the United States have tried to bring on for 30 years. He even mentions Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, describes him as almost giddy after the strike. Macgregor seems to read that as, a sign that a long-term goal, direct conflict with Iran, was finally achieved.
Right. And what about the actual strike, the trigger for this supposed war? How effective does Macgregor think it was?
Well, he's pretty blunt about it. Says it harmed nothing and accomplished nothing. Hit the equivalent of empty buildings, empty targets. That's his assessment.
So less of a military blow and more symbolic, or maybe just ineffective.
That seems to be his take, yeah. Almost like a misstep that didn't achieve anything concrete. And he connects this straight to U.S. policy, or maybe U.S. perception. He sees President Trump saying afterwards that the U.S. is ready for peace. Macgregor calls that the ultimate expression of self-delusion.
Self-delusion, strong words.
Very. Because in Macgregor's view, whatever talk about peace, the reality is the U.S. now has a full-blown war on his hands. He sees a huge gap between the official line and the actual situation on the ground.
And how does he think the American public perceives all this? Are people aware of the gravity he describes?
He's pretty pessimistic on that front. He believes that until the Americans are hurt in some demonstrable way, most Americans will not understand this.
So he thinks there's a disconnect, that people won't grasp it until it hits home, literally.
But that's the implication, yes. Sort of willful ignorance, perhaps, or just a lack of direct impact so far. He thinks only real pain will make the U.S. public fully aware.
Okay, so if the war has already started, according to him, what happens next? What are the consequences he foresees?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite alarming. He immediately predicts Iran is going to double down on its war with Israel.
Double down. Okay.
But then he goes much further. He says he'd be surprised if Israel is not entirely destroyed. Get this, within 2 weeks.
2 weeks? Destroyed! That's incredibly fast and catastrophic.
It's a shocking prediction. Not just escalation, but rapid, total regional transformation is what he seems to be suggesting.
And does he see this as just Iran versus Israel? Or are others involved?
Oh, definitely others. He immediately brings in major alliances. He states quite clearly that Iran is receiving and will continue to receive enormous amounts of aid and support, particularly from Russia and China.
So this isn't just regional anymore. It's framed as a global power struggle.
Exactly. That's how he presents it. Much bigger than just the Middle East.
And what about the economic side? Any ripple effects there?
Yes. Significant ones. He expects Iran, and likely its allies, will collectively decide to close the Straits of Hormuz. He paints a picture of like 50 oil tankers sitting in the Gulf, basically held hostage.
Closing Hormuz, that's huge for global oil.
Massive. Now, he does say it won't make much difference to us, the U.S., at least in the short run, but he stresses it will have a terrible impact on the rest of the world.
Think about it. Closing that choke point hits global energy markets, supply chains, instantly. It shows Iran's strategic leverage, and how vulnerable global trade is.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. What else? He mentioned consequences.
He talks about nuclear proliferation. He argues there's been no thinking, once again, about the long-term strategic consequences of U.S. actions. Meaning he believes these actions will push countries all over the world to build nuclear weapons. Why? Because, as he puts it, they don't want to be visited by the United States armed forces in the middle of the night.
Wow. So U.S. actions are driving proliferation in his view. That's his argument. He even goes so far as to say, "We are the threat. We are the rogue state supporting the other rogue state, Israel." It flips the script entirely on who poses the danger.
A rogue state. That's a heavy accusation. And does he see a specific trigger for this wider war against Israel he mentioned?
He points to Gaza. He calls Gaza the catalyst for the larger war that he thinks will begin against Israel.
A catalyst.
Yeah. He predicts a huge coalition forming, every Muslim country joining in, along with Russia, along with China. So Gaza isn't just a localized crisis in his analysis. It's the spark for a much bigger conflict, maybe even a global one.
Goodness. And the nuclear angle again? Does he elaborate on that?
He does, and it's dramatic. He says he expects that Mr. Putin doesn't make it very clear to Mr. Netanyahu, maybe he already has, that if he contemplates using a nuclear weapon, he needs to understand something.
Which is?
Basically, if you do this, if you use a nuclear weapon against Iran or anyone in the Middle East, we will use a nuclear weapon against you.
A direct nuclear threat from Putin to Netanyahu. He thinks that's happened or will happen.
He implies it's a very real possibility, perhaps already communicated. It sets incredibly high stakes.
So, underlying all this is his view that the U.S. just doesn't get it.
Precisely. He says, we don't understand what we've walked into because we're not informed. He thinks the U.S. is stuck in a 1991 mindset.
What does he mean by 1991 mindset?
Well, think back to the end of the first Gulf War. The U.S. seemed like the undisputed superpower, especially in the Middle East, able to dictate terms. Macgregor argues that thinking is dangerously out of date now. So when the U.S. talks about being ready for peace, he just dismisses it as self-deception. For him, the war is just beginning, and the U.S. is, well, unprepared for this new reality.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. What about the impact inside the U.S. domestically? Does he talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't hold back there either. He touches on how these events might affect Donald Trump's popularity. He notes, somewhat cynically perhaps, that all the hypocrites are denouncing this lawless act, but he suggests they'd have done the exact same thing themselves if they were in charge.
So he sees hypocrisy across the political spectrum on this.
That seems to be his implication. But then he makes a really controversial point about Trump's base.
Go on.
He claims the desertions from so-called Manguier have already begun because Manguier turns out to have been a myth.
A myth? What does he mean?
He points back to the 2016 Republican National Convention. He specifically mentions seeing an Israeli flag prominently displayed and what he describes as an Israel First placard. His interpretation is the people weren't just voting for Trump, they were, in his words, voting for Israel first. He seems to argue that a core part of that movement prioritized Israeli interests.
That's quite an interpretation of the Manguier movement and his view of the U.S. government overall.
It's incredibly harsh, almost apocalyptic, you could say. He calls it corrupt to its core, ineffective, and incompetent.
Doesn't sound like he has much faith in the system.
Not at all. He actually predicts it will come apart because this war is going to expand. He sees systemic collapse looming, sped up by this widening conflict.
And beyond the U.S. and Israel, what about the wider region, other countries?
He predicts major instability. He believes the family dictatorships that control the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf are not going to survive this.
Which ones specifically?
He puts the Saudis and King Abdullah in Jordan at high risk. Why? Because he sees this immense pressure building from, as he says, hundreds of millions of Muslim Arabs who are increasingly aware, unhappy, and demanding change.
So a wave of political upheaval across the Arab world driven by this conflict.
That's the picture he paints, a massive ripple effect.
And looking further out, what's his long-term vision for the U.S. in the Middle East?
He's very clear. We're inevitably going to be driven out of the Middle East, period.
Driven out. And Israel?
His prediction there is grim. We're going to watch Israel be destroyed day after day after day.
That sounds terrible, but he sees a silver lining for the U.S.
Paradoxically, yes. He actually calls this potentially grim outcome a damn good thing for us. His reasoning. We need to get out of these places. We need to come home.
So his view is that U.S. involvement there has been a drain, and getting out, even under these circumstances, is ultimately beneficial for America.
That seems to be the core of it. Focus on domestic needs, stop the foreign entanglement.
And domestically, besides the political side, any economic predictions tied to this?
Yes, quite specific ones. He foresees a very likely financial meltdown.
Meltdown? Like what?
He outlines a sequence. A negative reaction in the stock market, problems in the bond market, rising interest rates, and then inevitably serious inflation. He thinks these economic problems will get worse and fuel demands for change at home, especially a call for no more wars.
Does he connect this to internal security, too?
He does. He brings up the issue of open borders for years, expressing worries about something like the explosion of a dirty bomb inside our borders.
And linking back to his earlier point, he thinks Americans won't truly focus on these internal dangers until something bad actually happens domestically.
That seems to be his view, yes.
Yeah.
That direct experience is the only thing that will cut through the noise.
This all paints a picture of declining U.S. influence. What does he say about American credibility on the world stage?
This is maybe one of his starkest points. He believes recent actions represent a death blow to American credibility diplomatically.
A death blow, meaning?
Meaning, in his view, no one believes anything we say anymore. He thinks any diplomatic efforts by the U.S. are now basically a complete waste of time because no one believes that we can be trusted any longer.
So trust is gone, diplomatic influence is gone, according to him.
Completely eroded. A radical shift in how the U.S. is perceived globally, rendering its traditional diplomatic tools ineffective.
That's profound. If America's credibility is shot, as he claims, how does he see other big players like Russia and China fitting into this? Where do they stand?
Okay, let's look at Russia first. Macgregor directly challenges the narrative of Russia being weak. He says Russia is not as weak, backward, and incompetent as everybody said.
And militarily.
He points to their actions in Ukraine troops, bearing down on Kyiv, moving west toward Kyiv and Odessa. He sees this as a sign of strength, of offensive capability. And this is happening, he notes, at the same time they're supporting Iran.
So Russia is managing two major strategic fronts effectively, in his view.
It's his assessment, yes. A capable multi-front strategy.
And China. How does he characterize their role? Is China a military threat in this scenario?
Interestingly, no. He describes China as not a warlike nation by any stretch of the imagination. Their focus, he says, is purely business.
Business. What about Taiwan, then? That's often cited as a flashpoint.
His take is surprising. He predicts Taiwan will likely voluntarily join China, driven by economics, not military force.
Voluntarily, that's not the usual prediction.
Not at all. He even uses a kind of quirky example about naval ships. He contrasts the appearance of rust on Chinese versus U.S. ships.
Rust, what's the point there?
His argument seems to be that Chinese ships look less rusty because they spend more time in port, implying they're less operationally active, less aggressive in their patrolling compared to the U.S. Navy. It's his way of downplaying the idea of China as an immediate military aggressor.
Okay, so Russia is militarily active and strong. China is focused on business. How does Iran fit into this wider global picture he's painting?
He sees Iran as absolutely crucial. He states Iran is vital and essential to big international projects. He mentions BRICS, that group with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and China's huge Belt and Road initiative, that One Belt, One Road infrastructure project.
So Iran is key economically and strategically for them.
Yes, and also vital for Russian security. He says Iran borders Russia's soft underbelly in Central Asia, making it a critical security partner for Moscow, too.
Which leads back to his conclusion about Iran's fate.
Exactly. He repeats it very firmly. Iran is not going to be allowed to lose. There will be no defeat of Iran. He's convinced its powerful allies, Russia and China primarily, will ensure its survival.
Right. So let's try to sum this up. The core idea we have unpacked from Colonel Macgregor is that the U.S. isn't heading towards war with Iran. It's already in one.
Yes, a full-blown war, he says.
And he sees this conflict expanding dramatically with devastating results for the Middle East, impacting U.S. politics, the economy, and fundamentally shifting global power.
And running through it all is his consistent theme, a perceived, profound lack of strategic thinking, maybe even self-delusion within the U.S. leadership. He argues that real understanding, for the American people at least, will only arrive through significant pain and suffering at home. A harsh wake-up call.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it, if Macgregor's right, or even partially right, about world powers moving towards a sort of post-American order, and if U.S. credibility really is plummeting, what does that actually mean for global stability? How might international relations change in ways we haven't even thought about yet, especially if allies start doubting U.S. commitments because it's not seen as the reliable anchor anymore?
It certainly makes you think about how other nations might be jockeying for position in what could be a genuinely multipolar world, particularly if some, as Macgregor claims, increasingly view the U.S. itself as a rogue state. What new alliances form then? What happens to the old ones?
Lots to consider there. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Colonel Macgregor's very provocative analysis. We appreciate you spending your time with us. We'll be back soon with more insights to help you make sense of our complex world.